lecturer in geography, actually the School of Geography, but probably the department is Citizenship and Belonging in the University of Leeds, right?
No, the School of Geography, the department is the Faculty of Environment, but my position is Senior Lecturer in Citizenship and Belonging.
Right.
It's a bit complicated, but it doesn't matter.
She's a very interdisciplinary scholar, actually. She started as an architect, so there's one more mix to think about. She uses interdisciplinary approaches, sociology, anthropology, feminist and critical geography, combining a number of qualitative and visual research methodologies in her studies. The latest book is The Illegal City, Space, Law, and Gender in a Delhi Squatter Settlement. It's nominated to be honored at the Geographical Perspectives on Women event at the Association of American Geography annual conference. Probably happened already in Los Angeles, yes. Right? Okay, so we're really pleased to have her. She's one of our collaborators in this Worldwide Universities Network project, research project, Penn State, Leeds, and a couple of others you will meet in this group, like Argo Mohammed from Sydney, Maggie Hawkins from Madison, Ellen Hurst from University of Cape Town, Francis, John Papa from Bristol. So we are all collaborating, and Ayona Datta was working with us the last 2 days, sharing the data she gathered in Leeds. So we are very pleased to have you deliver the keynote for us.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Suresh, for inviting me and making me deliver the keynote. I'm a bit surprised and also very flattered and privileged because language and migration is not my key area, but having discussed our data in the past 2 days, I do see a lot of relationships and overlaps between our research. So here goes the translocal city, in which I think language is strongly embedded, given that my research was about Polish builders, Polish and East European, but in this particular talk, I'll focus more on Polish builders. So language was a key issue, and language and migration, the intersections of that, come up from time to time. But given my interests in urbanism, and I see myself primarily as a feminist and urban geographer, although as Suresh has pointed out, I don't have any formal training, and my training is a completely different discipline in architecture, environmental design, and planning. I do think I can, what I'm trying to do is bring together ways of thinking about migration, and particularly transnationalism, which is a big topic of debate in urban geography, migration geography, to think about those in a different way, perhaps, from the perspectives and the visual narratives that I'll present today of the Polish builders that I looked at. So my presentation today is really to look at the material, social, and cultural context of movement through a range of these mobilities or visual narratives of mobility of Polish builders in the City of London. And this was a research that I carried out around 2007 to 2008, and I've been publishing on that since then. So the reason I begin with the translocal city and not the transnational city is because London has been proclaimed and represented over and over again as a transnational city, as a global city. And I feel that in all of that, those narratives, London's iconic status, London's economic growth and prosperity is represented far more than the way that we can think about how migrants themselves create relationships which are often corporeal, affective, and material, and at the scale of a human with the city and the city spaces. And even if we talk about material spaces in the context of migration and transnationalism, we talk about these in terms of spaces of transience. So flyovers, malls, airports, railway stations, asylum detention centers, and those kinds of spaces form the quintessential spaces through which we think about migrants and transnational migrants' experiences of movement and mobility. So the reason I'm thinking about this as a translocal city rather than a transnational city, although transnationalism is the broader context in this case, is to think about the city itself as an everyday place, as not the iconic status or a place of economic growth per se, but rather as a mundane and everyday space of negotiations of mobility at all scales and at all different levels. So the city, therefore, and the city is important, of course, because it forms the key site of negotiation of these differences, particularly because London being a city that has been shaped by migrants. So London is significant as a city of migrants, and as a city that, therefore, through its many facets, provides the layers of migrant experiences that are highly spatial, corporeal, and material. So that's how I think about the translocal cities. So mobility, embodiment, and visuality, and I'll come to the notion of visuality very soon, becomes the key elements through which I'm going to talk about Polish builders' experiences in London. Oops. Okay, so I'm just going to start with this particular narrative because I think, again, it shows, at least to me, the kind of things that I'm really interested in talking about, the ways that we can think about the global city, not necessarily as global, but made through local connections. So this is Adam, and he began talking about London. One of the first questions that I would ask my participants, and I'm going to talk about methodology in a minute, so don't get worried, but one of the first things I would ask my participants is, what did you think about London? And so they began describing a lot about their first experiences, sometimes shock, sometimes similarities, and those kinds of things. But this particular migrant, Adam, and many of the others, in fact, and I would say almost all of the others, would describe London not just as London per se, which was there in the narratives, but also as particular neighborhoods. And Adam says that where he moved in first when he came into London was Green Lanes. And for those of you who don't know, Green Lanes is a North London neighborhood, which is primarily Turkish Cypriots, and some Greek Cypriots, but mainly Turkish Cypriots, and delicious Turkish food and Turkish shops selling all kinds of Turkish products. And so Adam moved into North London in Green Lanes. And what he says is it was really convenient. You could go out in your slippers, put the rubbish there, and of course in terms of shopping, we lived just above the off-license. So quick shopping was not a problem. To a Turkish shop and bought everything. But most of all, he knew us well, the shopkeeper. Sometimes we even got discounts. Lots of Polish people lived there, and of course, most of these Turkish people who knew me. At the baker's, everyone knew me. I always used to buy there, just around my house along the main street. In Green Lanes, everyone knew me. So when they saw me, they even stopped me in the street to have a chat or joke always. They just treated me. I don't know, as if I met some friend in my own neighborhood in Szczecin in Poland. And the same atmosphere, similar. So the reason as I said, I'm putting this forward is to just set the scene in terms of what I'm really getting to in the context of this bigger transnational mobility going from one national territory to other. There is also this, at an everyday mundane level, there's also this negotiation of urban spaces, particular neighborhoods, and in the ways that they're compared between home left behind and a home that's been made in this new city. So the comparison between one's local neighborhood in Szczecin and Green Lanes in London. So it's made, the home and notions of belonging are being made through local or translocal connections. So I think it's important to set it in that context of this transnational space. So what am I trying to say here, which is essentially a critique of transnational space, but not necessarily saying that we need to leave transnationalism behind, but rather saying we need to think about localism or translocalism as a parallel concept to transnationalism. And this will become evident again with another picture that I'll show. So transnationality has often been talked about as something that is across and beyond national spaces. And there's been a lot of research on that, and particularly the emerging body of research, which is heavily qualitative and talks about migrant experiences. But I think most of that, it would be fair to say that it takes national or nation as a primary point of reference. So the nation forms the primary scale across which the negotiations of migrants' experiences are being debated and discussed. And again, this might sound odd, perhaps, coming in this particular context where people are looking at very small issues like English language negotiations, but perhaps I'm coming from a different disciplinary background, which is in geography, particularly in transnational geography, nation is the primary point of reference. So the focus often has been on economic and demographic changes of sending and receiving countries. And yesterday we were talking about how migration studies itself looks at demographics, at big data in terms of how many people have moved, the number of remittances that's been sent, the development initiatives that have happened, and so on. And I mean, this image here is kind of representative of not necessarily that, but necessarily the notion of negotiation of migrant identities through particular national landscapes. So Guardian, the newspaper in UK, which is more or less a left-leaning newspaper, they ran this campaign because of this heightened media scare across UK at the time of EU expansion in 2004. They ran this campaign to show that migrants, Polish migrants or East European migrants who come into UK actually also contribute. And so this was this image of Piotr Dobroniak, who in Poland was a well-paid manager, and he's come into Britain as a laborer. And this was the general narrative that was presented as a counter-narrative to the narratives of, oh, they're taking our jobs. So, but I think in all of that, there's the migrants' economic practices, the social networks, entrepreneurial agencies, and diasporic belonging, all of that which is being discussed in a popular narratives or in wider societal narratives refers again and again to the nation, an imagined or actually existing nation. And this is, again, one of the Guardian images where they showed a map of the UK against which the different roles that Polish migrants perform are shown. And again, it's very economistic. It's about their economic contribution to British society. So it says suddenly everything has gone Polish, a special issue on the 1 million Poles in Britain, to show really that these are not scroungers, they're not taking your jobs away, they're performing essential roles and important roles in the communities that they are in. So what can geography contribute to that? Catherine Mitchell in 1997, actually quite some time back, she called for a geographic imagination to be inserted into transnationality, and her concern was that transnationality has become very deterritorialized. It's become very detached from local situated contexts, and it's evident in the ways that migration and transnationality is focused so much on national frameworks, on economic exchanges, and so on. So the spatiotemporal construction of migrant experiences, Catherine Mitchell suggested, was very, very important to take into account how migrants themselves understand their own roles, their own experiences, not necessarily always from a national perspective. So we arrived at the concept of translocality, and again, this is an image that was taken by my participants. All the images, by the way, that I'll show are taken by participants. And when I asked why he took this picture, he says this.
I don't want to picture, Big Bang or something like that. It's common, Everyone took it, so why should I?
Yeah.
Something interesting, something different. You don't have to be like everyone else. Yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
We were trying to show our lives, so not.
You've done really well. Yeah. Okay, so. This is another participant, and again, I mean, these are the narratives which emerge again and again in the interviews and the visual narratives that I took with the participants, that they were not interested in showing the iconic city, they were interested in showing their everyday lives in the city. And to a certain extent, it was a counter-narrative to the bigger pictures and the bigger narratives of the global city. So, what is translocality, and how am I reinterpreting this in the context of the city? Now, translocality is something it's a concept that has been going around for a long time, and particularly people like Arjuna Padarai, Ulf Hannes, they've been talking about translocality, particularly in the context of virtual connections and social networks. And they really present translocality as a very decentered and deterritorialized field, it is between and across locales, but they really say that it's not necessarily always across physical localities. It can be virtual connections. I'm taking my cue more from people like Michael Peter Smith and Guarnizo, who wrote about translocality as a subaltern strategy of transnationalism from below. And this is coming more from the urban geography perspective. And they suggest that translocality exists as a form of local connections that is both physical and imagined and social and all of those kinds of things. So it's not necessarily deterritorialized. It's highly embedded and situated in local contexts. So while for Padra and Hannes, the local global connections is what signify translocality and therefore a more virtual sense of connections, for Michael Peter Smith, it's a local connections that make up the experience of transnationality or transnationalism from below, very similar to the first slide I showed of Adam talking about Shenzhen and Green Lanes. And therefore, what I want to explore this is the situation in transnationalism studies about the embodied and affective and material connections which have been less explored in the context of localities, in the context of translocality. And to see how these mobilities that are not necessarily always virtual, but to understand how these mobilities that are not always part of virtual or travel across national spaces, for example, migrants, how they live their lives in London and how they are mobile across urban neighborhoods in London, for example. So in the context of this, how do I see locality in the context of translocality? So locality for me is a socially constructed space which is simultaneously material, meaningful, and symbolic, and connected to a range of other spaces and places through mobility, movement, settlement, and resettlement. And if you think about locality in that sense, locality doesn't necessarily confine itself to a particular scale of the home or the urban neighborhood. Locality itself is being renegotiated. So at a certain point, it can be a nation as a locale, as negotiating translocality, but at other times it can be urban neighborhoods. That is the point of the locale. So it depends, it's a spatiotemporal construct in the ways that migrants' experiences negotiate their lives in the city.